disabilities who have specific disability-related needs. That's why we use the term inclusive design or universal design. That's why these are preferable terms. Maybe also avoid using the term user in favor of saying person or human, because it's far easier to actually respect someone when you call them a human or a person, just like you, rather than othering them using a term like user. And that's why saying experience design and not user experience design. We're talking about the experiences for everybody. And this language is very important because it defines how we communicate these issues, and it defines how we then act upon these issues too. So above all, we need to be building meaningful products that serve people's needs and value their time. Kind of cautious in doing that we're not assuming that we know what's best for other people. I know this is kind of funny coming from a British person, but if we believe what's best for others, despite our differing needs, we can create patronizing solutions. This is sometimes referred to as colonial design. It's one of those examples is when you first learn about how to develop for a screen reader, you might start inserting lots of invisible text all over the page, just designed for a screen reader to understand. Extra directions, extra instructions that are just not necessary, because people who are using screen readers are very used to using web pages. So we need to design in a way that has focus. In order to design things that are genuinely useful, we need to design for purpose. Do that is starting with our content, because unless the content itself is accessible, nothing is accessible. Inclusive design for content often requires creating content for needs that are not necessarily the same as our own. And in order to understand those needs, we need to research and test our content with a diverse audience. And when we're talking about our audience, one of the things we have to be aware of is you might be saying, oh, my audience doesn't need this. My audience doesn't want that. Maybe your existing audience is limited to the people who are already able to access your content. Your existing audience might exclude people who've not been able to access your content because you're not designing inclusively in the first place. So I have a funny example of this, which is actually from my book, actually the book itself. So on the left, here you can see a screenshot of the PDF of my ebook. And on the right, you can see how it reads on an e-reader device. Now, these are showing examples of how a photo might appear to people with different forms of color blindness. It says 5 little photos of kingfishers in a row. What to think about is how that might appear in grayscale, because most the e-readers, they actually render in grayscale. And so you can't actually tell the difference between any of the images there. And there's nothing there on the page specifically describe how those images appear. So I haven't really made that particularly accessible to people who are looking at it in grayscale. So what makes for inclusive content? There are 4 broad parameters we need to consider when we're making our content accessible and things accessible in general. 1, we need to make it easy to see, accommodate visual needs, make it easy to hear, accommodate auditory needs. 3, we need to make it easy to interact, accommodate motor needs. And 4, we need to make it easy to understand and accommodate those cognitive needs. Creating inclusive content, the aim is to generally make all of our content accessible to as many people as possible, but sometimes this just isn't possible because people have needs that exclude particular formats. And so in that case, you want to provide alternative content. And I found a really nice example of this on freelance.tv. Someone shared it with me on Twitter. And for people who can't access the video, they actually have really beautiful transcripts. Nice alternative text form of the content. Actually, when you look at things like this, chances are you're already planning and writing and creating inclusive content, because many of the considerations you use to make your content readable and usable are the same as that. So here are some starting points, though, for making more inclusive content. Use plain language. Plain language benefits everybody, from people with dyslexia to people who are just not native speakers of the language you're producing your content in. I think a really good example of this is gov.uk, which is the British government digital service, where they really use like short, easy to read. It makes the text less intimidating and easier to skim. It makes it easier for people who have lower literacy levels. The audience for your content may vary depending on the technicality of the language you use may vary depending on your audience, but generally you want to avoid very complex jargon and metaphors. You want to make your content welcome to people, even if they're new to the area, new to industry. And these are absolutely everywhere. If you use acronyms, simple thing, explain their meaning alongside the first use. So here's a nice example from Hugo Girardel. It's an excerpt from his book on SAS, but it's been published on SitePoint. And here he writes about, it's writing about SAS, but there's the acronym CLI. Now, I didn't know what a CLI was for the longest time. It actually means command line interface. And so what he's done here is in the text, he's written command line interface with brackets, CLI. And that means when he uses the term CLI further down in the article, you know what he means because the meaning is there. And you might think, well, for a lot of acronyms, they're pretty obvious. But actually, it depends really on the context. It depends on your audience. I had a little look and I found CLI also means the Customer Loyalty Index and the Cultural Landscape Inventory. And things there. So using simple language and explaining the context of your words will also ensure that when you run your text through maybe a translation extension, it will likely translate into something more meaningful if you're not kind of using lots of very overcomplicated forms of words. You need to give your content a clear hierarchy and structure. And I think one of the best examples of this is actually Wikipedia. I mean, it's not particularly exciting, but they tend to have really clear headings. They have a contents at the top of the page to help you jump to a particular topic. It's really organized so that you can find information as quickly as possible. It doesn't have unnecessary information on the page. It doesn't have, I mean, this is the mobile version, which is slightly better and slightly cleaner, but it doesn't have loads of stuff vying for your attention. Because we all like to think that readers will pore over every last little word we've written, preferably with a dictionary, so that when we use the long and complicated words that make us sound very intelligent, people can look up what we mean and go, oh, yes, they're very intelligent. But in reality, the content that we're writing is being consumed very quickly by people. Often they're in a hurry. They might be looking to pick out specific information. And even if they're not, more of their time than's necessary. We don't want to be attention thieves. And clear hierarchy really depends on the context of our content, but it's really great if we order the content with most important information first. Learning from journalism, where in articles they aim to give you a summary of everything that's the key information in a news story right at the very top. Really great thing to learn how to do. Again, this is gov.uk with a really good example of putting important content first. If you're looking at a page on preparing for flooding, yeah, you probably want to know what's the most important thing if you're about to be flooded first. Later on, you can look at insurance and things like that, but that's not going to help you right away. We can make our content more inclusive and easier to understand and easier to read is to use headings to segment and label all of that longer content, all of the longer lengths of text. A really nice example of this is on the Wirecutter website. They've got these really great big headings that are really clear. This is for a bike review. They have why you should trust us, who is this for, very clearly marked out headings. And also right at the top, they do have the content, so you jump to the specific information that you want to find. These, of course, aren't just a visual feature. If we actually use semantic HTML to mark up things like headings, we can get a really nice layout. Now, this is just a rough outline. It's a page, and yeah, it's not perfect, but actually, if you look at the indented elements, having things like our pick, the name of the pick of the bike pump, underneath that, their favorite handheld bike pump, the name of that bike pump. So they have all of these things that are quite easy to jump to. One of the biggest things that I come across on so many websites is link language. So links are such a key part of the web. It's important we actually consider the text we're linking with. Descriptive linking is the best way of doing this, where the link actually describes its destination. So the reader actually knows where they end up if they follow that link. This can actually make a lot of your content shorter, because for this example, to get in contact with our team, click here. Contact with our team, you link the entirety of that sentence, and people know what's going to happen when they click that link. They know they're going to come to some kind of contact page. Click here. Readers can also read links on a page outside of the contents of the text, because links offer important landmarks in your content. And so it's vital that link text makes as much sense as it can without the surrounding text, without context, with just a list of links that all say click here. That's not going to be helpful if someone's just listening to here, 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 click here. So alternative content formats benefit those people who can't access your primary content format. And it can also give kind of a different option to people who just prefer different types of content. Ways to do this is to provide text alternative to things like images and videos and content, audio content. The obvious one is, of course, alternative text attribute for images. And yeah, you probably know about this already, but maybe I'll introduce something new to you. This is an image element, and it's got the source, it's got the link to the file, and it has the alt attribute, and I've just put in there describes the image. It's valuable. Well, it's fallback. So when we, this is an example from a spam email I got that happens to be from The Economist magazine. And you can see in the top left corner is where the alt attribute has come up, has worked. The sort of the logo of The Economist, when that doesn't show, they've provided an alternative attribute of The Economist, so you can see what the text is supposed to be, even if you can't see the right fancy font and the red square that makes it what it is. Actually really useful for email, because often email won't allow images to load, because one of the ways that people can track you. Meaningful alternative text is important, because maybe not everyone's going to read it, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't pay attention to microcopy. And a bonus is that it's indexable by search engines. C is photo of my dog as a description on an image. You don't really know, why have I posted that photo? What makes it notable? But you saw the text, my dog lying on the bedroom floor with his whole body visible but his head completely obscured under the bed, then you might start to get an idea of why I included that image in the first place, because my dog is silly. Need alternative text for decorative images, where if we leave the attribute actually empty, so we have include the source file as usual, we have the alt attribute, alt equals, and then we just include the quotes but empty. And that means that assistive technology will know to ignore that image completely. It doesn't need to describe it. hone the craft of alternative text while making your tweets more accessible is on social media. And so Twitter, they have in their accessibility settings, you can turn on the compose image descriptions option. It's kind of hidden in accessibility settings in your account settings, but once you turn it on, you have the option to add a description. And when you go to add a description, you get to see your image nice and big, so you can write the text in where it says, describe this video for the visually impaired. I mean, I have issues with having labels inside input boxes, but that's something for another day. Mastodon, which is a really great Twitter alternative, an ethical alternative, that includes the option to compose an image description by default. You don't have to activate it. It's there for everyone who uses Mastodon. I think that's really cool. Text alternatives are also really valuable for other visual content, like infographics and graphs. So this is a very simple kind of infographic, but this kind of information is quite hard to present in text in just kind of one single line. I mean, what would the text describing this infographic look like? Is it worth doing a dump of data? This, I mean, yeah, it's useful for an interested person, particularly if you have a lot of data with a lot of numbers, but it's not really the equivalent of an infographic or a graph. What is the story that we're trying to tell? Because when we use infographics or graphs, we're trying to tell a narrative, we're trying to draw attention to patterns, and provide more insight than just the raw data alone. And so it is a very simple line, and maybe it's not as detailed as I could make it, but maybe I would say the infographic shows how public awareness of social cooling has increased since the Snowden leaks in 2013. It kind of explains what the infographic means. Transcripts. So we should be creating transcripts of video and audio content. Transcript from the This American Life podcast, which is an audio podcast, and it can be a nice way of being able to read that as an alternative. Although you can see, if you look very closely, it actually says here, transcripts are generated using a combination of speech recognition software and human transcribers and may contain errors. Please check the corresponding audio before quoting in print. So it's not aimed at accessibility, it's aimed as a kind of backup to help people find it more easily. The thing is, transcripts are really juicy text. They can make audio content accessible to people who can't hear the audio, but they can also be a really useful alternative for people who want to skim through, find the content that interests them the most, as well as what I was saying before about making it searchable by search engine bots. But some of the transcripts can have particularly useful things. Like this is from that freelance TV example earlier. Different speakers in the text labeled. Because think about the amount of times you've listened to audio and you couldn't distinguish the two people's voices. You wouldn't know who was speaking because they sounded pretty similar. Go even further as well. You can add things like headings or other hierarchy that's not present in audio and video content. This Freakonomics blog transcript, they have links in the text so that they can reference other information, which is actually providing so much added value over the audio itself. As we well know from this event having live captions, which is fantastic, we can use captions or subtitles for video content. And I always get muddled up between what's the difference between a subtitle and a caption. But subtitles are lines of text that are transcriptions or translations of the speech on screen. So here's an example from Vimeo where they've got a nice subtitle there. Closed captions similar, but they also include oral information such as sound and music, which is not the speech, but is relevant to the speech or its context. So maybe if you have random noises in the background, like road noise, that's not particularly notable. Here's an example I found just from a quick search on videos on Vimeo, snapping. I'm not even sure what the context was, but it's an example of how you can present another sound. Captions and subtitles can be pretty time consuming to produce. I mean, very hard work if you're doing it live. Especially compared to transcripts as well, because you need to specifically time the text that you've produced to the video so that it appears at the right point. Example of a captions that I made for a video on our website, and the thing is, it might be time consuming, but the software is free. So this is a software called Joomla, which is free and open, and is straightforward to use. It's not beautiful, but it's very straightforward to use. And you can see here how I've lined it up with the different timestamps, and even things that allow you to import the audio so that you can listen to it easily whilst you're going through and producing the text. Is using auto captioning that's provided by video platforms such as YouTube, but auto captioning is never going to be the same quality as the captions crafted with care and a knowledge of the actual subject matter. And this is an example from a video talk that I did, and this is how it looks on YouTube. Whenever I said advertisers, it wrote appetizers. Pretty different talk then. Is that producing particularly captions can take around 3 times as long as the length of the video for me. And that's me as someone who's pretty amateur with the tools, but a reasonably fast typer. I don't know. But I'd say that that's not that long an amount of time. That time investment is definitely worthwhile. See now that social media is actually getting on board with captions, and yeah, maybe it's not generally for accessibility purposes, and often is not in a way that's available to assistive technology, but it's a start. They're getting there. And so here on the left is an example of news on Twitter, where the video of the news, they have captions, and on the right there's a bad ad on Facebook, and they have captions describing what's going on in the video. And this is because all of these videos play mute by default. And so you need to have captions in order to draw people into your content. So I hope I'm convincing you, I'm sure you know already, that good accessibility is good usability. And that brings me to a much thornier topic. Can they be beautiful? Because a lot of people keep saying that they're not. And I think this is silly. I do wonder whether we true sometimes when people often go to websites about accessibility and maybe are not the trendiest and newest and cleanest designed of all the websites. And so they kind of confuse this and think, oh, well, this means that accessible websites cannot be aesthetically pleasing. And the thing is, aesthetics are a part of usability. And I'm talking about aesthetics as design, not just kind of decoration. In a minute. The thing is, ugly design is not accessible design because it's not usable. We're not making art when we're producing websites. We don't need to make things wacky for the sake of being different. We do not need disruption for the sake of disruption. I mean, people like to use disruption as if it's a positive term in the tech world, but actually, things that need to be disrupted. Find beauty. I mean, are our sites supposed to be these works of art, or does the beauty come from the simplicity, the thoughtful decisions, and the thoughtful aesthetics that we've designed in order to help our interfaces do the jobs they're designed to do? And so I've got some aesthetic principles here from the perspective of creating functional interfaces that actually look good. Really help people with cognitive impairments particularly. And it will also be valuable to people who are newer to technology and don't really understand its conventions. We need to have interfaces presented to us where you can understand what is the purpose, how do I use it, what happens when I use it. And one of the ways we do this is through affordances. We use affordances to convey this information, those visual cues that help you understand how something is supposed to be used. And so here's examples of things you'll be able to press on a page. How do we know which of these are items we can interact with? And what do we expect to happen when we actually press them? One of my pet peeves, buttons and links for links. Like this button to execute an action. Like this, you expect a link to take you somewhere. And will execute an action, take you to the next step. But it's not that often that the nuances are that different between a button and a link. Interfaces shouldn't surprise you. Interfaces make it really hard to use, particularly for people who are struggling with memory and attention, or people who just think about interfaces in a different way from how you do. Convention is really valuable here. Conventions in design are there for a reason. They're easy to understand, and so they're easy to use. It's unlikely you're going to be the next person to invent the next big convention for website design. So just stick with those that already exist. You don't need to be different for the sake of being different. This is a part of designing with purpose behind, leaving the showing off friend behind, and just trying to create great interfaces for the people who are looking at your websites. This is an example of all these different types of navigation you can have that all run along the top of the page. And you know why they do that? Because that's we know when links are presented side by side like this, we know what to expect from them. That's the flip side of conventions, is don't just do things because everybody else is doing it. So you see that little asterisk at the end of the text, little red asterisk? That's one of my pet peeves. The idea that on a form field, we would understand that it's a required field just because there's an asterisk there is, I don't understand why people think it works. Why not just use the text saying it's a required field? Relationships are key in explaining the context in aesthetic design. So if we're back to this example of how do we know which things we can press, which things we can interact with, and which things we can't, actually it's often the differences between these items that shows us which are interactive. You know that perhaps the text with a line underneath it compared to the text that doesn't have a line underneath it. You might know that the text with a green background behind it is more likely to be a button than text that has no background behind it. The similarity and contrast in the relationships provide this information. To make the content relationships clear, this is why layout is so important. It might seem like an obvious thing that we're just kind of used to, but actually it's very important. We're used to seeing headers at the top of the page. We know that's telling us about the site. Then you see the actual content itself grouped underneath it. The secondary content is not at the top because it's not most important, so kind of stick that down the side somewhere. And here on this particular example of a news website, the primary content has kind of textual buttons, these icons for Facebook and Twitter and email and things like that. They're relevant to the content, and so they're shown alongside it. That's why it's also important to give plenty of space around your content to help people distinguish what's the important stuff and what's the not important stuff. Help people understand the relationship between those elements. And space is also important because we don't want to overcrowd our interfaces. It's really hard to read something if you've got a stupid flashing ad in your peripheral vision. It's really hard to read things when interfaces are really overcrowded and have lots of distracting elements. It makes it very hard to focus on one thing at a time. I don't want to underestimate the power of that single column layout. If it works on a mobile device, why shouldn't it work on desktop? also important for people using keyboard navigation to ensure that the layout order reflects the content order. And this is particularly important when we're coming to things like flexbox and grid layouts nowadays, because it's really useful to change the layout if you want maybe your sidebars or something different. The top row here has an example of 3 blocks of content, and underneath there's 3 blocks of content where I've changed the order of that content. So it's different from what it would be in the source order. But if someone's using keyboard navigation, that's going to be very difficult to use. So if someone's using keyboard navigation, they might tab between A, B, and C like that. But what if the layout is out of order? Then you might be skipping between elements differently. Get that to work properly. It's different from what you expect. What if the third element in the layout is actually somewhere off the screen? You can't see where you're tabbing to because the layout has been changed. Width is also really important. Thinking about things like line length for the readability of your typography, arranging your line lengths comfortably off of text like this, it's not comfortable to read. And you might be even turning your head from one side to the other to read from one end of the line to the next. And you need to be able to have these within a comfortable width to make it easy for people to hold their attention from the end of one line to the beginning of another. Of course, depends on font size, and some people judge how wide some text should be based on the characters in a line. But generally judge what you think would be best. And this is an example, I think, of a slightly more comfortable line length. And this brings me on to typography. Choose your typefaces according to readability first. Suitability to your content second, and never just because you think it looks cool or because it's a fancy new web font. So this is an example of some of the subtle differences in typefaces that can make them easier or harder to read. So Heinemann on the left was specifically designed easier for people who have low literacy or have dyslexia. And the reason why it varies from Georgia on the right is that Georgia is not just a serif font compared to Heinemann, which is sans serif. But if you look at Heinemann, it actually resembles the way that you would draw the letters A, G, and Q when you're first learning to write. And so this is how it would appear in a lot of the books and sort of text content for people who are of lower literacy as well, compared to the letters in a serif font. And you may be able to read both perfectly fine, but the second just requires that bit more cognitive load. Font sizes are everything. Designers are often tempted to use very tiny text because it looks neat and tidy in the layout, but small text isn't tidy, it's just small. If your text is too small to read, there's no point in it being there. So this is an example of that. It looks so lovely and neat, like a little rectangle in the middle of the screen. But it's hard to read. Why are we even using the text in the first place? Font resizing. I'm not going to go into this in any more detail other than just don't. Font weights. These have an impact on readability too. These lightweights, the one on the far right here, the very thin text, it might be crisp and pretty on a high definition screen, but it lacks contrast, which might make it difficult for people who don't have as fancy screens as you do, who don't have high definition. And also it's worth bearing in mind that you might need to use different weights of fonts. You might want to have emphasis in your text if you're using things like the strong HTML element. You might want to make sure that that renders differently so that the visual weight represents the weight of the content. Height is important because you might have a functional typeface choice and size, but if your line height is too tight or too loose, it can be oppressive or distracting. It makes it far harder to read when the text is running into each other. So this is an example where the line height is 80% of the font size. 150, see, it's the lines that were too wide, you really have to make a huge jump from the end of the line to the beginning of the neckline. I usually prefer somewhere between 110% and 120% of the font size, but I like quite roomy lines compared to a lot of people. Don't use icon fonts. Just unless you're willing to do a lot of work for progressive enhancement, they are far more trouble than they're worth. Color. Color is valuable, but it shouldn't be a crutch. So it shouldn't be something you're scared of, but you shouldn't use it as a sole means to convey information, particularly when you're using it to show that there's an error on a page or something like that. This is what that previous text looks like in grayscale. You can see that whether the text is red or green, it's very hard to distinguish. But how it could be if you know when that shows you have a spelling error and it has that dotted line underneath. Just having that dotted line underneath adds that extra context to what that different styling actually means. That example also shows how important it is to use high contrast in your background text and your foreground text, so it's actually readable by people who have those differing visual needs. So they might be colorblind, might have just a lack of clarity and vision. Someone might be short-sighted or long-sighted. They might be using their screen in a bright light outdoors. Color contrast really helps with that. Depending upon how well is streaming this and how fancy your projector is, this could be either very, very low contrast or reasonable contrast. One of the tips that I learned from Jerry Cody is to test all of your designs in grayscale to find the weaknesses in your reliance on color. And this is a beautiful section of the Simply Accessible website that Jerry designed with their team. And you can see she's used a huge amount of color. She's used beautiful typography. And it's perfectly readable in grayscale as well as color. So you can see that the contrast is really good. Here's with these examples, I show that you have room for creativity when you're trying to be more inclusive in your design. These are simple principles. Limbo, this is another website. It's a job site. They really care about accessibility. Yeah, right now they have a few things that are less than ideal. There's some quite small text and maybe the color contrast isn't perfect. It's a really beautiful design. Text generally very easy to read. The points where you can actually do things are incredibly clear. The underlying front end is very accessible to assistive technologies too. Distinguish our products and our services and ourselves on the fact that we actually care about each other. It's quite intimidating when we start to think about the potential impact of our work when we're building these everyday things, because join the industry because of this. Maybe you just joined it for potential. You might have joined because there's new shiny technologies to play with, or because you like the idea that the web democratizes information, or that things that you built have a huge reach, but you're not necessarily thinking about all these different people that you're trying to include in your work. You think maybe you didn't sign up for this. But the thing is, there are people building these things now. To the people who design and build roads, they have to consider the design of a road and how it fits into its environment. How is it designed? What the geological properties of what is built, how people might use those roads. Because you wouldn't really want to use a road where they didn't consider your needs. In common with the people who build roads, because people who build roads designed that thing and build that thing and use that thing as well. And so this is one of the reasons why we wrote the Ethical Design Manifesto at Indie, because we thought we needed to actually look at how we approach the design of everyday things. So if you think of a product, a project, or even a business like it's an apple, this product should be all of these things, including inclusive, because it respects human rights. Yeah, that's a really strong core, and that's something that we're generally not very good at in technology. We tend to be very good in technology is building things that are functional, convenient, and reliable. Once we've got that core, this is the edible, fleshy bit, the bit that and the bit that respects the human effort. You can layer delight on top. That's the shiny, attractive bit around the outside of the fruit, because that respects the human experience. So when we respect human rights and we respect human effort and we respect human experience, we call this 3 R's of ethical design, if I don't skip past my slides too quickly. When we don't respect the core, when we do not design things, there are a lot of modern products that are like this. They might look beautiful and tasty on the outside. On the inside, the appearance is just superficial. It might look really tasty on the outside, but you don't want to eat that apple. This is decoration, not design. These products use decoration to make their true intentions and their true design more palatable. They don't really care about your rights. And if you want to know more about the Ethical Design Manifesto, you can see it at imd.ie/ethical design. We're not building things that are inclusive. We're creating rotten fruit. Rotten fruit is burdensome, but it's creative. If we build products that are unethical, they're a burden to us. What happens when you build things that aren't accessible? Rotten fruit, people are eventually going to start complaining. This brings me back to my example in the beginning. To be ethical, the point of the products we build is important. We need to build these ethical products and services for our own future, for us as individuals, and to benefit society as a whole. It's not actually illegal to be unethical. When we look at the roads comparison, yeah, it's probably pretty illegal to build roads that don't take things like safe and good design into account. But it's not necessarily illegal to build unethical technology. It's not illegal to build inaccessible products in many areas. Been around for thousands of years. We've iterated over them. We've mostly standardized them to suit the requirements of different types of pedestrians and vehicle users. We keep iterating over how we produce roads themselves. We better designs and more sustainable materials. Point yet with technology. We're still in the early iteration part of building internet technologies. There's some laws, there's some regulation depending on where you live, but there's not that much that actually dictates how we should be building technology. So really we need to think about building it for our own sake. Building it for your future self, who might have different needs or who might be vulnerable in a different way to you. So I want everyone to build ethical products. So I wrote a book and it's called Accessibility for Everyone. And it was published in September by A Book Apart. And of course, you can get 15% off at A Book Apart, and that's on paperbacks or the ebooks if you use the code A111CHI. I don't think is important, but I'm going to have to double check that. So let's get going.
Alrighty, so see if I can not mess this up. What I want to do is I want to give Ottawa the ball and go ahead and ask any questions you might have for Laura.
Are you on mute?
Yeah.
I can see it. Oh, there we go.
See. Muted. Okay. I'm sorry? Let's see here. Screen sharing. Hold on. You would think I could just toggle this.
Excellent. So we have a question. Finally, sorry.
Hey, hello.
So you had your question?
Yes. No. Mana. There we go. Hi, my name is Alvaro here in Ottawa. So when you were talking about the alt texts, one of the things I was thinking about is how do you add the notion of emotional cues to the alt tags? Because if you have, like, I mean, even if you have the sound like in the closed captioning, it seems like it might still seem a little bit flat. So have you given much thought around, you know, how do we convey some of the cues that may be lost with doing things just in text?
Are you talking? So you're talking about in captions and subtitles.
Yeah, like when you describe
the alternative text as in images.
Well, when you describe the dog lying under the blanket, you know, if the kind of, I'm thinking of like Imgur, right? So if the underlying kind of emotion is, you know, it's like, oh, isn't that cute? But all I read is, you know, it's a dog lying under a blanket. I'm thinking, okay, well, so, you know, but, you know, so you may miss some of that, like the cue factor, I guess, you know, for lack of a better word. Yeah.
That's the same in a lot of the text content that we write generally. We try to write things that have more emotion.
Ottawa, when someone's responding, you're gonna have to mute your mic, otherwise we're gonna get a feedback loop on all sides.
Far left top bar.
Okay, you're good now.
Okay, go ahead, Laura.
Okay, so this is actually just a general copy problem as well. When we're writing copy for about pages, when we're writing copy, when we're trying to introduce ourselves, we try to insert emotion in that way too. So I think that it's really an exercise how we can do that. I mean, I probably didn't do the best example with the dog photo because it wasn't as funny as it could be. But that's something that I need to keep working on, that I need to keep practicing, is how can I convey that as well as I can in text. Yeah, some things might just not translate as well. Sometimes the joke is very visual, but at least you're not leaving people out or excluding them from the joke entirely. One of the examples I give is I had a tweet go viral on Twitter, and it was a really stupid, as they call, dad joke. I found a photo of a packet of spinach called teen spinach, and I wrote, smells like ... photo of teen spinach. Stupid joke. I hadn't added any alternative text then. I didn't know about adding accessibility features on Twitter, and I had someone send me a message going, actually funny about that joke because I can't see the image, so I don't know what the joke is. It isn't just a case about trying to, yes, we want to make it as emotional, as involved as possible, but sometimes it's just as much as not excluding people.
Okay, Ottawa, any other questions?
Any more questions?
So this is Mike, and I had a question about your experience not developing for individual sites, but you've also built large projects like Indie. And what was your experience trying to go off and to build for a more generalized implementation rather than for a specific website? So when you're building software that's going to be used in multiple contexts and where you're not necessarily going to be able to control how or how a user is going to be using a particular piece of software. Like generalizing software and accessibility, how do you try and work towards that? There's things that you can't necessarily, if you're building a specific site, you have control and knowledge of how that is going to be implemented, who the users are, what the context is, but you don't when you're building the bigger the infrastructure is, the less you know about your users. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. I think that also applies to when you're working for a very small organization and you may not have so many resources in order to test with the widest range of people possible or research with the widest range of people possible. And one of the things I try to do is, in designing inclusively, you're trying to continually think about how people might use this differently from you, but also how can you make this the simplest thing you can possible? How do I distill this down to its absolute purpose? Because a lot of the time, the ways in which we make things less usable is by adding all of these additional frills and sort of fancy features that aren't necessary and aren't valuable to the purpose of our product. And then the key thing is to have as open a dialogue as possible in order to allow people to tell you when you're going wrong. And when people tell you you are going wrong or have done something that it doesn't work for them, or one of the examples with what we build for Indie is we have an app where we display web pages inside of a native app. And what web pages can do is resize depending upon the text. On iOS can resize so that it fits the user's size preferences for their device. But we hadn't done that because I assumed that it would just be done automatically, and never assume something. And so when someone said, oh, could you make this so that it works with dynamic text so it matches my text preferences on my device, rather than saying, oh, being all defensive, oh, well, we don't know about that, we don't want to look at that. What we do is we say, oh, of course, yeah, we've got actual real people that we know here are having a problem with what we built, and we can fix that problem pretty easily. To do it is to make sure that you're as open as possible to iterating as you go, never considering what you've built as the final polished product, and always improving it and always working on listening to people and improving it for their needs.
Okay, I want to open it up to the folks here in Chicago. 1 second. This is where we get that lovely thing. Screen sharing. Okay, we're going to stop screen sharing or present to everyone. I'll do this. Oh, there we go. Okay. Does anyone here have any questions for Laura? And what I'll ask you to do is tell me, and then I'll sit, because the microphone's a little weak here. So, okay, go ahead.
She mentioned CSS and Flexbox. I guess comparatively, is Flexbox more or less accessible versus, say, Float?
So the question is, and keep me honest, with regards to CSS Flexbox, is it more or less accessible compared to other layout methods like floats and such?
I think if you compare it to something like absolute positioning, then it could be the same, because it's about how much you take an element out of its natural flow. I mean, with things like floats positioning, you can't take things very far out of their source order without being really hacky. But I would say that generally, I think that things like Flexbox by default have the potential to be far more accessible, because they are stopping you from adding a lot of additional markup. You don't need that extra markup in order to lay things out in a particular way anymore. And so I think that you're more likely to write meaningful HTML that reflects the content itself. And really, it's more a case of, if you're going to start doing things like changing the entire order of your page, because you can with Flexbox, rather than changing the entire order and laying something out, you change, if the order is going to be different, you actually change that order in the source itself and continue laying it out in Flexbox or Grid or something similar to that. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Great.
Any other questions here from Chicago? Okay, Laura, I think you did too good of a job. There's no questions here. Let me open it up to...
Well, I'm always on Twitter and things like that as well.
I know. Ottawa, any other questions? One more question from your side?
We got lots of questions.
Hi, me again. So it's just more of like, I guess almost like an interesting case. So there's an app out there called Be My Eyes. I don't know if you're aware of it, but so for those of you that don't know it, essentially you sign up as a sighted person, and basically people with blind people sign up as well. And if they need help with like odd things like figuring out which color sweater they should have, or help picking out a different kind of mustard from the fridge, they use the app with their phone, and you're essentially their eyes, and you tell them which product to choose. One of the ones that I did recently was a blind person basically wanted to know, they wanted to have a stout beer, and from their fridge they couldn't tell which one was which, so they said, which one of these is the stout, and they had 3 beers in a row, and it's like, oh, it's the middle one, and it's like, okay, great, thank you. And I thought, how funny is that it's like, we think of accessibility essentially, being in our various kind of rectangles, but it's really, if it's out in the world, it's the little things that we take for granted, such as which beer to choose if you have 3 of them in the fridge, and then suddenly we have the ability, like through our phones or whatnot, to almost be like that human API, where we can actually go in and be the eyes for somebody. So it was more of a comment than a question.
I think that kind of thing is great, and actually I think that's a really good exercise we can use for people who maybe don't understand the value of accessibility or the value of inclusive design and why we're doing it. And showing them something like that can really empower them, understanding the impact of what they're building and understand how they can really make a difference to someone, because that's one of the hardest issues we really have working in accessibility, is how do we convince other people to care about it? Because to most of us, it may seem, well, it's straightforward, it's caring about people. But actually, if you don't have experience, if you haven't got needs yourself, or you haven't had experience with a friend or family member that has particular needs that makes using the web difficult, maybe you don't know. Maybe you're not able to empathize with people in that situation so well. I think it's a really great example.
Okay, final question from either Ottawa or Chicago. Oh, we got a question here. 1 second. Yes.
So, Laura, where do you feel accessibility is going to go in the future with advances in technologies revolving around virtual reality and augmented reality?
So, Laura, where do you think accessibility is headed with the latest technologies such as augmented reality and virtual reality?
Okay, I think this is really interesting. I think it could be very, very positive. It could be really impactful, particularly if there are algorithms that help people, like the example of the app that you have someone helping you tell you what's in front of you. You could have that done by image recognition and through algorithms and things like that that allow you to work that kind of thing out. The important thing that we should actually think about here is information and who is tracking that information. Because actually I think that the key issue in that, while it could be very positive from an accessibility point of view. And we have to think about what companies are actually doing with this knowledge about what we're pointing our devices at. What kind of situations are we in? Is that something that's private to us? Is that data being organization against us? So I actually think that it brings up, it's incredibly positive in terms of how it can go. There are already apps coming out that are using things like augmented reality and an AI in order to do things like that. But we have to think about the implications for the users as well.
Okay, I'm just checking to see if there's a question on the interwebs here. Going once, going twice. Okay. Before I let Laura go, you guys do realize in Chicago, it's 7 hours ahead of this time. It's 2 a.m. in the morning. So I really want to give Laura a round of applause. Because I know I'm...
No, I appreciate you all come out.
Oh, yes, and I know I'm normally in the middle of my second dream by this time. So we want to give away a copy of Accessibility for Everyone. And we have a list of people here. We have a list of people in Ottawa. I almost said Montreal. I'm sure they'd kick me in the shin for that. You're going to do the random, the draw. Okay. So, and I don't know where this person is. So, you know, stand up, jump up and down, either in Ottawa or Chicago. Rachel Sinnen. Do we have a Rachel Sinnen? Okay, moving on to the next name. Marta Snyder. I'm looking at Ottawa here. Marta Snyder? No? Okay. Great, we like that. We like that. Okay, next. We could be here a while. Keisha Green.
Yes.
Yes! Chicago gets it.
Hey.
I will give you a copy of Laura's ebook. I want to thank everyone in Ottawa, everyone in Chicago for attending, and definitely I want to thank you, Laura, for all the work you did to put this presentation together. Greatly appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right, I'm going to let you get some shut-eye, so I'll be following up with you tomorrow, okay?
Okay, fabulous. Have a lovely evening.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ottawa. Talk
Thank
later.
you, Ottawa. Bye.